Jamie, thank you very much for joining me this evening. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Michael.
All right, so what we just heard there, I want to focus on what the defense did. Now, the defense basically took the two most difficult issues with his case, the phone call and these tapes made by Erica, and he basically pointed the finger of the phone call to the mom. And then he said on the tapes that she was just sort of acquiescing to what they wanted because they were making threats. I didn't think that would carry the day, but clearly the jury's been out for 9 hours. You have her words, or Erica's words, on tape confessing. So I'm just surprised that they're out. They must have carried the day somehow.
You know, I think there's certainly a lot of thought that's going back in that jury room at this point in time. You know, I think the latter point that you bring up is the one that, in my opinion, brings the most weight. And that is the idea that, and somehow these tapes maybe are just not being interpreted correctly. The idea that the mom somehow was a co-conspirator, I think, is a stretch. But, you know, you throw it out there, see if spaghetti sticks against the wall. But the idea that somehow these tapes are, you know, you've called it a confession. And look, these are damning. This is damning evidence. There's no getting around that. But Michael, what I would suggest to you is that his point that this family is going through it for some period of time, and that she has a vested interest in not making them upset, you know, keeping them on board, and certainly not getting in a situation where, you know, things can be used against her, I think has some merit. And I think that at the end of the day, you know, if a jury is back there balancing, trying to figure out, did Erica just agree for the purposes of her mother-in-law not coming after her, you know, is that plausible? I think it is. I think it's reasonable.
You know, Jamie, we're at a bit of a disadvantage because the defense constantly made the point that this is a 3-hour tape and you have to listen to the whole thing, excuse me, to get the context of what was said by Erica Stefanko. Now, we have not been able to hear all 3 hours. We heard snippets. I think 16 or 17 snippets were played by the prosecution, a couple played by the defense. So overall, we don't have that sort of perspective. But you have to admit at this point, you know, the words that were said on the tape, and the prosecution even said it in their closing, believe her, believe what she says. And I think clearly they're not believing her, and they're looking, I think it's fair to say that they're looking for something else to hang their hat on, and maybe they're not finding it.
Well, I mean, after 9 hours, I think we have to believe that this tape has not been overly convincing at this point in time. You know, I mean, especially in contrast to some of the other evidence we've heard, in particular, you know, Mr. Cobb's cross-examination or direct examination testimony, where he basically said in no uncertain terms that he did not kill this woman, which we all know, you know, is not true. You know, and so I think at this point in time, the jury is probably back there dealing with some difficult concepts. And I think sometimes people want to get, when we deal with these sorts of trials, I think that sometimes the viewers and many people, they want to figure out who did it. And that is not the job of the jury. The job of the jury is to figure out whether or not there's been proof beyond a reasonable doubt that, in fact, Erica committed this crime. And if that is the concept that the jury is struggling with, if that is their rules, if they've accepted that, if they're not back there trying to prove who did it, but on the other hand, trying to figure out whether or not there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Erica did it, I think when you look at the contrasting evidence that I just discussed, this is a very difficult decision for them, because the goal is not to figure out whether or not that tape proves she did it. It's really a balancing of all the evidence. And when you take all the evidence, Michael, into consideration, this is a challenge for this jury, and it's clearly playing out over the course of 9 hours.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, Jamie. I think there is a lot more to consider than just that tape, and that's probably what they're doing. All right, Jamie, stand by. We got a lot more to discuss, but right now we're going to take a quick break. Ahead, we're going to look at the testimony of one of the early witnesses in this case. The name Cindy Cobb, the mom, keeps coming up, the former mother-in-law of the defendant in this case. Stay with us.